Among all the legendary gunmen who roamed the Texas frontier, perhaps none left a more enigmatic legacy than William "Silent Wind" Reed, a humble trail scout whose very name would later send chills down the spines of even the most hardened outlaws. A man who once quietly stated, "Some men shoot to be feared. I shoot so others don't have to live in fear." Join me today as we delve into the story of the man they called Silent Wind, the shadow of the Texas plains, who proved that the deadliest predators are the ones who never seek the fight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special for you. Broken Ridge, Texas Territory, summer of 1875. The settlement was like many others carved out of the untamed frontier, a dusty collection of weathered buildings where desperation and hope mingled beneath the scorching Texas sun. Nestled between the winding Serpent River and the looming Dragon's Spine Mountains, it was the kind of place where most folks were too busy staying alive to ask questions about their neighbors' pasts. That's exactly why William Reed chose it. He rode in on a sweltering June morning, leading a mule laden with surveying equipment and trail maps. Those who witnessed his arrival would later recall two things: the unusual precision with which he handled his Winchester rifle, and how his voice never rose above a whisper when he asked directions to the surveyor's office. His buckskin jacket, worn but well-maintained, bore the subtle marks of countless miles on the trail, while his eyes carried the sharp alertness of a man who'd learned to read danger in the smallest signs. The people of Broken Ridge were accustomed to drifters and travelers passing through. Their town sat at the crossroads of several major cattle trails. But something about Reed was different. He moved with a fluid grace that some mistook for caution, his watchful eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if reading signs others couldn't see. Even his horse, a sturdy blue roan, seemed to share its rider's quiet vigilance. Sheriff Marcus Kane, a grizzled veteran of both the war and the frontier, watched the newcomer from the shade of his office porch. In his journal that evening he wrote, "Two kinds of men read trails in this territory, those who learned from books and those who learned from blood. This Reed fellow, his eyes tell me he's read volumes written in red." Dr. Sarah Martinez was the first to interact meaningfully with the mysterious newcomer, treating a snakebite that Reed claimed he got while surveying. She couldn't help but notice how he never flinched during the painful procedure, nor how his body bore the kind of scars that no simple trail scout should have. Bullet wounds that spoke of close encounters, knife marks that told tales of desperate fights. But Sarah was a woman who understood discretion in a land where too many questions could be fatal. The answers she didn't seek spoke volumes about the respect Reed would quickly earn in the community. Within days, Reed had established himself at the surveyor's office, taking on contracts to map the treacherous terrain around Broken Ridge. Old Jim Cooper, the town's resident surveyor, found himself impressed by Reed's encyclopedic knowledge of the territory. "Man knows every canyon and waterhole from here to El Paso," Cooper told the regulars at Hannah's saloon. "Reed's sign like an Apache scout, but something in the way he handles that Winchester tells me he's done more than just map-making in his time." The Winchester in question rode in a custom-tooled leather scabbard, worn but meticulously maintained. Those with keen eyes noticed how the rifle's stock bore notches, 17 of them, each cut with surgical precision. When asked about them, Reed would simply say they marked important survey points. But Sheriff Kane, who'd seen his share of fighting men, recognized them for what they really were, a tally that spoke of deadly encounters. Mary Chen, who ran the general store with her father, observed other peculiarities about their new neighbor. Reed always bought his supplies in careful measure, never too much to weigh down a fast horse. His purchases often included unusual items: brass cartridges for a sharps rifle he never seemed to carry, detailed maps of territories far beyond his surveying contracts, and enough ammunition to supply a small army. But what caught Mary's attention most was how Reed positioned himself in her store, always with his back to a wall, eyes on the door, hands free and ready. She'd seen that stance before, in her father's old friend from the war, a man who'd served as a sharpshooter and never quite left the battlefield behind. At night, those who passed by Reed's small cabin on the outskirts of town sometimes reported seeing him practicing with his Winchester in the moonlight. The speed and precision of his shots seemed almost supernatural, though he never bragged or showed off his skills in town. Hannah, the saloon keeper, once remarked that she'd seen him draw and fire at a rattlesnake that threatened a child, the motion so smooth and quick that most observers missed it entirely. As summer wore on, Broken Ridge began to accept Reed as one of their own, though questions about his past lingered like dust in the air. He attended Sunday services, though he sat at the back near the door. He helped local ranchers with their property surveys, charging fair prices and offering advice about the land that proved invaluably accurate. Yet there remained something about him, something in his quiet watchfulness and precise movements that suggested a man who carried more than just mapping tools in his saddlebags. Little did the people of Broken Ridge know that their unassuming trail scout would soon become their only hope for survival, as a shadow from the past was riding hard toward their town, bringing with it a storm of violence that would reveal exactly why William "Silent Wind" Reed was considered the deadliest shot in the West. The first signs of trouble came to Broken Ridge like a distant storm on the horizon. Tom Burke, a cattle driver passing through town, stumbled into Hannah's saloon one scorching afternoon, his face pale with more than just trail dust. He'd found something out in Dragon's Pass: 3 dead men, their bodies arranged with deliberate precision, each taken down by a single shot from extreme range. "Never seen anything like it," Burke told Sheriff Kane, his hands trembling around a glass of whiskey. "Whoever did it, they was playing with them boys. First shot took the leader's gun clean out of his holster. Second one knocked the rifle right off another's saddle. Only the third was meant to kill, and that was after they'd started shooting back." The sheriff studied the spent cartridges Burke had collected from the scene. They were from a sharps rifle, the kind favored by long-distance shooters, the same caliber as the brass Reed bought from Mary Chen's store. The dead men weren't ordinary bandits. Their gear was too fine, their horses too well bred. One of them carried a gold pocket watch with an inscription that made Kane's blood run cold. To Jackson, with respect, Colonel Sebastian Cross. The name brought back memories of the war's darkest days, of a Confederate cavalry unit that had turned to brutality with frightening precision. That evening, Reed rode into town for his usual supply run. Mary Chen noticed how his eyes lingered on the wanted posters that Kane had just put up, sketches of men matching the descriptions of those found in the pass. The trail scout's face remained impassive, but his hands moved with subtle tension as he purchased more ammunition. "Trouble coming?" Mary asked, trying to sound casual. Reed's response was characteristic, quiet, measured, but heavy with meaning. "Trouble's been circling for a while, Miss Chen. Now it's just getting closer." At the surveyor's office, old Jim Cooper was piecing together his own puzzle. Reed's latest maps showed he'd been systematically charting every approach to Broken Ridge, every hidden canyon and water source, not the work of a man simply documenting the territory. These were the calculations of someone preparing for a siege. "Your map works mighty thorough," Cooper remarked, watching Reed mark another trail, "almost like you're expecting company." Reed's hands never paused in their precise movements. "In my experience, Mr. Cooper, it's better to know the battlefield before you need it." The word battlefield hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Dr. Martinez had her own revelations that week. Treating Reed for a minor cut, she noticed fresh powder burns on his sleeve, not the kind that came from casual target practice, but the distinctive marks of long-range shooting. Her father, a surgeon in the war, had taught her to read such signs. "Those men in the pass," she said quietly, cleaning the wound. "They died quick?" Reed met her gaze, something flickering in his eyes. "The guilty always die quicker than the innocent, Doctor. It's mercy of a sort, mercy of a..." The pieces were falling into pieces for Sheriff Kane, too. He telegraphed contacts in other territories, and the responses painted a disturbing picture. Sebastian Cross, once a decorated cavalry colonel, had emerged from the war with a different kind of glory. He'd turned his military precision to crime, building an empire of intimidation across 3 states. His men were all former soldiers, disciplined, well-armed, and utterly ruthless. But there were other whispers too, stories of a mysterious marksman who'd been systematically dismantling Cross's operations. They called him the Ghost Shot, a sniper who could take down targets from impossible distances, who left survivors with stories that seemed more legend than fact. 17 confirmed kills, they said. 17 notches on a Winchester's stock. Kane found Reed at sunset, practicing with his rifle behind his cabin. The scout's shots rang out with mechanical precision, hitting targets so distant they were barely visible to the naked eye. "Those men in the pass," Kane said without preamble. "They were Cross's advanced scouts." Reed lowered his rifle slowly. "Yes, and you've been hunting them." It wasn't a question, but Reed answered anyway. "Not hunting, Sheriff, just making sure they don't hurt any more innocent people." Kane studied the quiet man before him, seeing him in a new light. "The Ghost Shot. That's what they call you back east." A ghost of a smile touched Reed's lips. "Ghosts are just stories, Sheriff. I'm just a man who's good with a rifle." But they both knew it was more than that. The way Reed had positioned himself in Broken Ridge, the careful mapping of the territory, the systematic preparation. He hadn't chosen the town randomly. He'd been setting a trap, using himself as bait to draw out something darker. As night fell over Broken Ridge, lights twinkled in windows like earthbound stars. Good people living simple lives, unaware that their quiet town had become the board for a deadly game of chess. In his cabin, Reed cleaned his Winchester with practiced care, his fingers tracing the 17 notches on its stock. Soon, he knew, there would be more. Sebastian Cross was coming, bringing with him the kind of violence that could tear a town apart. But this time, the colonel would find more than just another frontier settlement. He'd find the man who'd been systematically destroying his empire, the scout whose deadly accuracy had become the stuff of nightmares. The Ghost Shot was done running. Broken Ridge would be where it ended one way or another. The truth about William Reed emerged like a mirage taking shape in the desert heat. It started with a stranger arriving in Broken Ridge, a weathered man wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge who introduced himself as James Hawkins. He found Sheriff Kane at his usual spot on the office porch, watching the town's morning bustle with careful eyes. "Heard you might have a ghost in your town," Hawkins said without preamble, settling into a chair. "One that's mighty accurate with a Sharps rifle." Kane studied the Marshal carefully. "Lot of good shots in Texas." Hawkins pulled out a worn leather journal. "Was stationed at Fort Davis during the war. Worked with a scout there. Best marksman I ever saw. Could hit a target at 1,000 yards. Read sign better than any Apache tracker. Man named William Reed." The Marshal's voice dropped lower. "But that wasn't his real name. Back then, he was Lieutenant William Richards, commanding officer of the 3rd Cavalry's sharpshooter unit. His men called him Silent Death. Said he could take down an enemy without anyone ever hearing the shot." Kane's face remained impassive, but his mind was racing. Reed had just ridden out that morning, checking his network of trail markers around town. The marshal seemed to read his thoughts. After the war, Colonel Cross led his men on a rampage through Texas. Richard's family had a ranch near Austin. Hawkins paused, the memory clearly painful. Cross's men killed them all. Wife, daughter, even the ranch hands. But they made a mistake. Richards wasn't home. He was out scouting for the army. In Mary Chen's store, Reed was purchasing more ammunition, his movements precise and measured as always. Mary had come to recognize the subtle signs of tension in his bearing, the way his eyes swept the street more frequently, how his hand stayed closer to his Winchester. "My father was a scout too," she said quietly, measuring out powder. "During the war, said the hardest part wasn't the shooting. It was living with the knowledge that every time you pulled the trigger, you were ending someone's story." Reed's eyes met hers, something flickering in their depths. "Your father was a wise man. He also said sometimes it's necessary, that there are men in this world who only understand one language." At that moment, Dr. Martinez burst into the store, her face tight with concern. "Riders coming in from the south," she announced. 6 men, heavily armed. "They're asking questions about the ghost shot." Reed's transformation was subtle but immediate. His posture shifted slightly, hands moving with fluid grace as he checked his Winchester. "Get word to the sheriff," he said softly. "Tell him it's starting." The riders were Cross's men, former cavalry soldiers turned outlaws, their military bearing evident in their precise formation as they rode into town. Their leader, a scarred man named Jackson, wore the same gold watch that had been found on one of the dead men in Dragon's Pass. They spread out along Main Street, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Jackson dismounted in front of Hannah's saloon, his spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk. "We're looking for a man," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "Tall fellow carries a Winchester, calls himself Reed. Ghost shot, some folks name him." The town's response was silence. Broken Ridge had come to see Reed as one of their own, and frontier folks protected their own. Jackson's face darkened. "Colonel Cross is offering $5,000 for information. That's good money for just pointing a finger." From his vantage point in the surveyor's office, Reed watched the scene unfold. Old Jim Cooper stood beside him, gripping his own rifle with steady hands. "Them's military men," Cooper observed. "Way they move, how they position themselves, like they're preparing for a fight." "They are," Reed replied softly, "just not the kind they're expecting." The first shot came as Jackson was mounting his horse to leave. It struck the ground between his feet with surgical precision, sending up a puff of dust. The second shot knocked his hat off before he could blink. The third bullet whispered past his ear close enough to feel the wind of its passing. All 3 shots had come from different directions. "Ghost shot!" one of Jackson's men shouted, drawing his pistol. "He's got us surrounded!" But Reed had already vanished from the surveyor's office, moving through the town's back alleys like a shadow. The shots had been carefully planned, fired from positions he'd pre-sighted days ago, using the terrain to bounce echoes and confuse his targets. Jackson and his men fired wildly at the surrounding buildings, but they were shooting at ghosts. When the echo of gunfire died away, they found themselves alone in the street, their horses skittish from the noise. "Tell Cross," Reed's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, "that if he wants the ghost shot, he'll find him here. But remind him what happened to the last 18 men he sent." The riders spurred their horses hard, leaving town in a cloud of dust. As the tension eased, Sheriff Kane found Reed checking his rifle behind the jail. 18? Kane asked. "Thought there were 17 notches on your Winchester." Reed's hands never paused in their methodical work. "Jackson just earned the 18th. He was there that day, at my family's ranch. Held my daughter while Cross—" His voice, barely a whisper, trailed off. The truth lay exposed now, like a wound under desert sun. William Reed, the quiet trail scout, was a ghost of war's legacy, a man forged in loss and tempered by vengeance. But as he looked out over Broken Ridge, at the people who had accepted him without question, something else stirred in his heart. "They'll be back," Kane said, stating the obvious. "Yes," Reed agreed, his voice soft but determined. "But this time, I'm not just protecting my own memories. This town, these people, they deserve better than to live in fear of men like Cross." The sun was setting over Dragon's Spine mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In Broken Ridge, people went about their evening routines, but there was a new tension in the air. They had glimpsed the true nature of their quiet scout, and they knew that their town was about to become the battleground for a reckoning long delayed. Word of the confrontation in Broken Ridge spread through the territories like wildfire, carried by stagecoach drivers and cattle hands. The story grew with each telling, how the legendary ghost shot had appeared and disappeared like morning mist, how he'd toyed with Cross's men using impossible shots that seemed to come from thin air. In saloons from El Paso to Dodge City, men spoke in hushed tones about the coming storm. Colonel Sebastian Cross received the news at his fortress-like ranch in the Davis Mountains. The former cavalry officer's face remained impassive as Jackson delivered his report, but his hands tightened on the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. 8 years? Cross said softly, his cultured Virginia accent at odds with the coldness in his eyes. 8 years I've been hunting the ghost that's been picking off my men, and now he shows himself in some dusty backwater. He rose, moving to a map mounted on his study wall. No, he chose Broken Ridge for a reason. The question is why. Marshal Hawkins, still in town, was asking himself the same question. He found Reed at dawn, checking sightlines from the church steeple. The scouts' movements were methodical, each position noted in a small leather notebook with precise calculations. "You've turned the whole town into a shooting gallery," Hawkins observed, studying Reed's preparations. "Every street, every alley, you've got it all mapped out." Reed made another note before responding. "Cross trained his men to think like soldiers. They'll try to take the town using military tactics. That's their weakness." "And yours?" Hawkins asked quietly. "Your family's been dead 8 years, Will. Vengeance is a harsh mistress to serve for so long." Reed's hands stilled on his notebook. "This stopped being about vengeance the day I realized what Cross really was. He doesn't just kill, James. He destroys everything good he touches. Communities, families, hope itself. Somebody has to stop him." In town, preparations were underway. Mary Chen had converted her store's basement into an ammunition depot, carefully organizing supplies with the same precision she'd learned from her merchant father. Dr. Martinez stocked extra medical supplies, transforming the back of her clinic into a field hospital. Even Hannah had turned her saloon into a strategic asset, its high windows offering clear lines of sight down Main Street. Sheriff Kane found himself amazed at how the town had rallied around their quiet scout. Old Jim Cooper spent hours with Reed, their combined knowledge of the territory helping to identify every possible approach to Broken Ridge. Young men who'd grown up shooting rabbits for dinner now practiced with their rifles under Reed's quiet instruction, learning to make every shot count. "Never seen anything like it," Kane told Marshal Hawkins over coffee. "Man barely speaks above a whisper, but they listen like he's shouting from the rooftops." The Marshal nodded thoughtfully. "Saw him do the same thing during the war. His sharpshooter unit would have followed him into hell itself, not because he demanded it, but because he showed them how to survive it." The first warning came from Tom Burke, who'd been keeping watch in Dragon's Pass. Cross's men were gathering, not just ordinary outlaws, but former soldiers, all of them veterans of brutal campaigns. They moved with military precision, establishing camps at strategic points around Broken Ridge. Reed studied the patterns of their campfires at night from his cabin. "They're setting up a proper siege," he explained to Kane and Hawkins. "Cross remembers his West Point training. He'll try to isolate the town, cut off supplies, wear us down before making his move. How many? Kane asked. 40, maybe 50, all experienced fighters. Reed's voice remained calm, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. He's being careful this time. No random violence, no unnecessary killing. He wants me, not the town. But he'll destroy Broken Ridge to get to you, Hawkins stated. No, Reed replied softly, checking his Winchester with practiced hands. He'll try. That's why I chose this place. These people, this town, they're not just innocent bystanders. They're the trap he doesn't see coming. Mary Chen found him later that evening, making his usual ammunition purchase. But this time she had something else for him, a sleek brass spyglass that had belonged to her father. He used it during the war, she explained, handling the instrument with care. Said sometimes the key to survival is seeing trouble before it sees you. Reed accepted the gift with quiet grace. Their hands touched briefly during the exchange, and something unspoken passed between them. In another time, another life perhaps, but Cross's men were moving closer, tightening their noose around Broken Ridge. Reed spent his nights positioning supplies at strategic points throughout the town, ammunition, water, medical supplies. During the days, he worked with the townspeople, teaching them not just to shoot, but to think like the soldiers they'd soon face. Cross expects to find a town of shopkeepers and farmers, he told them. Show him instead what free people can do when they stand together. Dr. Martinez, watching him drill her neighbors in basic tactics, finally understood what set Reed apart from other manhunters she'd known. He's not just preparing for a fight, she told Kane. He's teaching us to protect ourselves long after he's gone. The tension built as more of Cross's men arrived. The outlaw leader was gathering his forces methodically, determined to overwhelm the ghost shot with sheer numbers. But Reed had spent 8 years studying his enemy, learning his patterns, understanding his mind. The quiet scout stood on his cabin porch that evening, watching the sun set behind Dragon Spine Mountains. In his hands, he held his Winchester, fingers tracing the 18 notches on its stock. Soon there would be more, not for vengeance now, but for protection, for the right of good people to live without fear. The ghost of Lieutenant William Richards was about to show Colonel Sebastian Cross why some men are feared not for their cruelty, but for their unwavering dedication to justice. The storm broke over Broken Ridge 3 days later, beginning not with gunfire, but with a single rider approaching at dawn. The man carried a white flag and wore a Confederate colonel's uniform that had been meticulously maintained despite the years since the war. Sebastian Cross had arrived to parley. Reed watched from the church steeple as his old nemesis rode down Main Street. Cross sat his horse with military precision, his silver-streaked black hair and trim beard giving him the appearance of a distinguished gentleman rather than a ruthless killer. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, cold and calculating as a rattlesnake's. "You know why he's really here," Marshal Hawkins said quietly, standing beside Reed in the steeple. "Studying the ground, marking positions, looking for weaknesses." Reed's hands remained steady on his Sharps rifle. "I know, but so are we." Cross reined his horse to a stop in the middle of town. Sheriff Kane and Marshal Hawkins met him there, while Reed remained hidden, his rifle trained on the colonel's heart. Through his scope, he could see the same gold watch chain that had adorned Jackson's vest, a subtle message that hadn't gone unnoticed. "Gentlemen," Cross called out, his Virginia accent smooth as honey, "I've come to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. I seek only one man, the coward who calls himself the Ghost Shot. Deliver him to me, and my men will ride away. Broken Ridge need not suffer for his sins." Kane's response was measured but firm. "Seems to me the only sins we're concerned with are the ones you and your men have committed, Colonel. The Ghost Shot's been protecting folks from your kind of justice for 8 years now." A shadow passed over Cross's aristocratic features. "Protecting," Is that what you call murdering 18 men from ambush, picking them off one by one like animals?" His voice hardened. "Did he tell you about his own crimes? How he executed wounded Confederate soldiers after the war? How he—" "I executed murderers and thieves who happened to wear Confederate gray." Reed's voice carried clearly from somewhere above. "Men who followed you into darkness, Cross, just like you followed them into my family's home 8 years ago." Cross's head snapped up, searching for the source of the voice, but Reed had already changed positions. The colonel's hand strayed toward his pistol, but stopped as a bullet kicked up dust inches from his boot. 8 years, Reed's voice came from a different direction now. 8 years I've hunted your men, 18 notches on my rifle. But you were always the one I wanted. Then face me, Cross shouted, his composure cracking. Face me like a man, not a ghost. Like you faced my wife and daughter, my ranch hands. Each question came from a different position, Reed's voice seemingly everywhere and nowhere. No, Colonel, you'll face me the way I choose, when I choose. Fury twisted Cross's features. I have 50 men surrounding this town, 50 trained soldiers who'll reduce Broken Ridge to ashes at my command. Look again, Reed replied softly. Cross turned in his saddle, studying the ridgelines where his men had been positioned. One by one rifles appeared, not held by his soldiers, but by townspeople. Old Jim Cooper, Mary Chen, Dr. Martinez, and dozens of others stood ready, covering every approach with the steady aim Reed had taught them. Your men have already been pushed back, Reed explained, his voice calm. While you were studying our defenses, we were disrupting yours. Check your camps, Colonel. Count your sentries. Cross's face paled as he realized the truth. During the night, Reed had led groups of townspeople in synchronized strikes against Cross's outer positions. Using the scouts' intimate knowledge of the territory, they had systematically isolated and disabled key elements of the siege force. These aren't helpless farmers anymore, Reed continued. They're free people defending their home. Every shot you've taught me to make over the past 8 years, I've taught to them. Marshal Hawkins stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sun. Ride away, Colonel, while you still can. For a moment it seemed Cross might accept the offer. Then his hand flashed toward his pistol with military precision. But Reed had anticipated this too. A shot cracked out, and Cross's gun went spinning away before he could level it. Next one won't miss, Reed's voice promised. 8 years of waiting, Cross. I can take any shot I want. The colonel spurred his horse, retreating at a controlled canter that couldn't quite be called a run. At the edge of town, he reined in for a final declaration. You've turned them all into killers, Ghost Shot, just like you. When this is over, their blood will be on your hands too. No, Reed's response was quiet but carried clearly. I've taught them to defend themselves. The killing will be your choice, Colonel, just like it always was. As Cross disappeared into the morning haze, the townspeople maintained their positions. They had won the first round, but everyone knew the real battle was yet to come. Reed descended from his hidden perch to join Kane and Hawkins. He'll hit us at sunset, Reed predicted, studying the terrain. Use the light in our eyes. Try to overwhelm us with numbers. Kane nodded grimly. Then we'll be ready. Mary Chen approached, carrying Reed's Winchester. She had been guarding it while he used the sharps for long-range work. Their fingers brushed as she handed it over, and this time neither pulled away quickly. We all have choices, she said softly. We choose to stand with you. Reed looked around at the determined faces of the townspeople, shopkeepers, farmers and ranchers, who had become warriors in defense of their home. They had chosen this fight, chosen to become something more than victims. The sun climbed higher over Broken Ridge, burning away the morning mist. In a few hours, Cross would return with all his remaining force, determined to destroy both the Ghost Shot and the town that sheltered him. But as Reed checked his weapons and reviewed positions with his impromptu militia, he felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible day 8 years ago. Hope. The Ghost Shot wasn't just a phantom of vengeance anymore. He had become something more. A teacher, a protector, and perhaps after all these years, a man ready to live again rather than just survive. The hours before sunset crawled by with agonizing slowness. Reed used the time methodically, positioning his defenders with the same precision he'd once used to place military sharpshooters. Every roof, every window, every alley had been transformed into a carefully planned firing position. The quiet scout had turned Broken Ridge into a fortress where every civilian was now a defender. Mary Chen and Dr. Martinez had converted the general store's basement into a field hospital, stocking it with medical supplies and ammunition. The two women worked with quiet efficiency, their movements showing the careful training Reed had given them over the past weeks. "He's changed," Mary observed, organizing bandages. "Since Cross arrived, it's like he's come alive again." Sarah Martinez nodded, checking her medical instruments. Sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the wound itself. It's finding a reason to live after it's healed. Up in the church steeple, old Jim Cooper watched the surrounding terrain through Mary's brass spyglass. The surveyor's intimate knowledge of the land, combined with Reed's tactical expertise, had helped them identify every possible approach to town. Now he spotted movement in the gathering shadows. "They're coming," he called down softly. "Moving through Cedar Creek Draw, just like you said they would." Reed appeared beside him like a shadow, taking the spyglass. Through it, he could see Cross's men advancing in disciplined formations. The colonel was deploying his forces with military precision, using the terrain for cover. But Reed had anticipated this, had prepared for it during his months of careful surveying. "Pass the word," he instructed Cooper. "No one fires until they hear my shot. Let them think their approach is undetected." Sheriff Kane and Marshal Hawkins had positioned themselves at opposite ends of Main Street, each commanding a group of townspeople. Kane found himself amazed at the transformation of his neighbors. The same farmers and shopkeepers who'd once avoided trouble now handled their weapons with quiet confidence, their faces showing the same steady resolve he'd seen in Reed's eyes. The sun touched the peaks of Dragon Spine Mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Cross's men emerged from the shadows like ghosts themselves, moving in coordinated groups toward the seemingly quiet town. The colonel had divided his force into 3 units, one approaching from the east along Main Street, another coming through the collection of smaller buildings on the west side, and a third working its way around to flank from the north. Reed watched it all from his elevated position, his Winchester ready but silent. Cross was using classic military tactics, the kind taught at West Point. Divide the enemy's attention, split their forces, then overwhelm them with superior numbers. But the quiet scout had spent 8 years studying his opponent, learning to think like him in order to defeat him. The trap was about to spring. The first sign that something was wrong came when Cross's northern force encountered hidden barriers Reed had constructed during his surveying work. Simple obstacles, overturned wagons, carefully placed debris, forced them to bunch up in pre-sighted killing zones. Still, Reed held his fire, waiting. The main force moved cautiously down Main Street, their boots eerily quiet in the dust. They passed the saloon, the general store, the doctor's office, all seemingly deserted. Cross himself rode in the center of this group, his military bearing evident even in the fading light. Only when the Western force reached the exact position Reed had calculated did he take action. His first shot wasn't aimed at any of Cross's men. Instead, it struck a carefully prepared series of support beams. The resulting cascade of timber and debris cut off the Western force's retreat and advanced simultaneously. That shot was the signal his defenders had waited for. Broken Ridge erupted in coordinated fire. Every window, every rooftop, every shadowed doorway concealed townspeople who had learned to shoot under Reed's patient instruction. Their shots weren't wild or panicked. They fired with deliberate precision, just as the ghost shot had taught them. Cross's men, expecting to encounter untrained civilians, found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. Their military training worked against them, making their reactions predictable to Reed, who had spent months preparing for exactly these tactics. "Fall back!" Cross shouted, wheeling his horse. "Regroup at—" His orders were cut short by a shot that took his horse out from under him. The colonel rolled clear, drawing his pistol, but found himself pinned down behind a water trough. "8 years ago you surrounded my home," Reed's voice carried clearly despite the gunfire. "Thought you had every angle covered, thought your military training made you invincible." More shots rang out, each one precisely placed to herd Cross's scattered forces into prepared killing zones. The colonel's careful formations had been shattered, his men forced to seek cover wherever they could find it. "You taught me well, Colonel," Reed continued, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Taught me how men like you think, how you plan, how you fail." The sun had set completely now, leaving Broken Ridge in deepening twilight. But unlike 8 years ago at the ranch, this darkness belonged to the defenders. Reed's people knew every shadow, every corner, every possible angle of fire. They had practiced for this moment in daylight and darkness until the town itself had become their weapon. Cross's men began to break, their military discipline crumbling in the face of an enemy they couldn't effectively fight back against. This wasn't the straightforward battle they had expected. This was something else, a carefully orchestrated demonstration of everything the ghost shot had learned during his 8-year hunt. As night fell over Broken Ridge, the first phase of the battle was ending. But Reed knew this was just the beginning. Cross hadn't survived the war and its aftermath by giving up easily. The quiet scout had bloodied his enemy's nose, but the real fight was yet to come. The question was, would Cross learn from this first defeat, or would his military pride drive him to make an even greater mistake? The night brought no peace to Broken Ridge. Cross's men had retreated to the surrounding hills, but their campfires burned like accusatory eyes in the darkness. Dr. Martinez worked tirelessly in her makeshift hospital, treating the few wounds the defenders had sustained. To everyone's amazement, none of the townspeople had been killed in the first clash, a testament to Reed's careful preparation and training. "He's planning something," Reed told Kane and Hawkins as they gathered in the sheriff's office. "Cross won't accept being outmaneuvered like this. His pride won't let him." The marshal nodded grimly. "Man like Cross, he's used to being the smartest one in the fight. You've wounded more than his forces. You've wounded his ego." Through Mary's spyglass, they could see unusual activity in the enemy camp. Riders were coming and going, carrying messages into the darkness. Cross was calling in reinforcements, gathering every gunman and outlaw who owed him allegiance. "He's abandoned his military precision," Reed observed, his voice thoughtful. "Now he's just going to try to overwhelm us with numbers, make it too costly for the town to keep fighting." Old Jim Cooper, who'd been watching the enemy movements from the church steeple, brought more concerning news. Cross's men were constructing something in their camp, large wooden frameworks that they kept carefully covered. "Siege engines," Reed explained, his face grim. "Cross is remembering his history lessons. He'll try to breach our defenses from a distance, force us to spread ourselves thin." Mary Chen found him later that night as he made his rounds, checking positions and encouraging the defenders. She carried a pot of coffee and a determination in her eyes that matched his own. "My father used to say that the most dangerous moment in any fight is right after your first victory," she said, pouring him a cup. "That's when you're most likely to get overconfident." Reed accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Your father was a wise man. Cross is counting on that, hoping we'll think we've already won." "Have we?" she asked quietly. Before he could answer, a series of explosions rocked the night. Cross had begun his counterattack, using dynamite to create chaos and confusion. The blasts weren't aimed at buildings, but at the carefully prepared defensive positions Reed had established. "Everyone hold!" Reed's voice carried over the chaos. "Stay in your fallback positions." This, too, he had prepared for. The positions Cross was destroying were decoys. The real defensive line lay elsewhere, invisible in the darkness. The quiet scout had learned from 8 years of hunting that sometimes the best defense was to let your enemy think they'd succeeded. Cross's men charged forward behind the explosions, expecting to find the town's defenses in disarray. Instead, they ran headlong into devastating crossfire from positions they hadn't known existed. Reed had created a deadly labyrinth, using his intimate knowledge of the territory to turn Broken Ridge's very structure against the attackers. But Cross had learned too. His men were using the siege engines now, mobile wooden walls that provided cover as they advanced. Behind these shields, they pushed forward methodically, trying to force the defenders to exhaust their ammunition. "He's trying to make us fight his kind of battle," Marshal Hawkins observed, watching the enemy's approach. Reed's response was characteristic, quiet but decisive. "Then let's change the rules." He had prepared for this as well. During his months of surveying, he'd mapped every water source around Broken Ridge. Now, with careful shots at key points, he triggered a series of controlled floods. The waters of Cedar Creek, diverted by previously prepared channels, swept through the attackers' ranks. The wooden siege engines, so effective against bullets, proved worse than useless against the rushing water. Cross's men found themselves fighting not just the defenders, but the very terrain itself, yet the colonel proved why he'd survived so long. Even as his first attack faltered, he launched another from an unexpected quarter. A group of his men had worked their way through the hills to the north, using the chaos of the main assault as cover. They emerged behind the defenders' lines, threatening to trap the townspeople between two forces. This was the moment Cross had waited for, the instant when military strategy could finally overcome guerrilla tactics. But he had underestimated how thoroughly Reed had prepared his people. Mary Chen, manning her position in the store's upper floor, spotted the flanking force first. The signal went up, 3 sharp whistles cutting through the night. The townspeople responded with practiced precision, falling back to secondary positions that turned the attackers' advantage against them. Now it was Cross's men who found themselves caught in a trap. The same buildings that had provided them cover became a maze that separated and isolated them. Reed's defenders, moving through pre-planned routes, picked them off with methodical efficiency. "This is what I've been teaching them, Cross," Reed's voice carried across the battlefield. "Not just how to shoot, how to think, how to work together, how to turn your own tactics against you." The colonel's response was a series of sharp orders, pulling his men back once again, but the cost had been high. The ground around Broken Ridge was littered with casualties, men who had followed Cross's orders into a trap more complex than any he'd anticipated. As dawn approached, both sides watched each other warily across the blood-stained battlefield. Cross had lost nearly 1/3 of his force, but he still commanded enough men to maintain the siege. The question hanging in the pre-dawn air was clear. What would break first, the colonel's pride or the town's resolve? The battle devolved into a series of running fights through the town's streets and alleys. Cross's men, now fighting in small groups, proved more difficult to track and engage. But the townspeople had trained for this too. They fought in pairs, covering each other, using the intricate network of defensive positions Reed had established. Marshal Hawkins found himself amazed at the transformation. These weren't just townspeople defending their homes anymore. They were warriors protecting their community. Each person knew their role, their position, their responsibility to the whole. "Never seen anything like it," he told Kane as they coordinated the defense. "Man's turned the whole town into a single fighting unit." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Cross thinks he's fighting one man. He doesn't understand he's fighting all of us." The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher over the battlefield. Cross's attacks came in waves now, probing for weaknesses, testing defenses. Each assault was met with coordinated resistance, the townspeople working together with a precision that matched anything the colonel's military training could produce. But the cost was mounting. Ammunition was running low in several sectors. The defenders were tired, strained from the constant vigilance. Dr. Martinez's clinic was filling with wounded, though thankfully none yet fatal. Reed moved through the town like a shadow, appearing wherever the fighting was heaviest. His shots never wasted, his presence inspiring confidence. But even he could see that Cross was setting up for something bigger. The colonel had kept his best men in reserve, including his personal guard of former cavalry officers. They waited in the hills, watching, learning from each assault. Cross was building toward a final massive attack, one that would test Broken Ridge's defenses to their limit. As noon approached, the fighting temporarily lulled. Both sides used the break to tend their wounded and replenish ammunition. Reed found Mary Chen distributing supplies from one of the hidden caches. "He's adapting faster than I expected," Reed admitted quietly. "Learning from each attack." Mary's hands were steady as she counted out cartridges. "Then we'll adapt too. You didn't just teach us to shoot, William. You taught us to think, to work together. Cross doesn't understand that." Reed looked at her, seeing the same determination he'd once seen in his own wife's eyes. "No," he agreed softly. He never understood that real strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them. The quiet scout checked his Winchester, fingers tracing the 18 notches on its stock. Soon there would be more, not for vengeance now, but for the future of Broken Ridge and its people. The final battle was coming, and this time it would determine not just his fate, but the fate of an entire community. Cross's final assault began with an eerie silence. The shooting stopped, the shouting ceased, and a heavy stillness fell over Broken Ridge like a burial shroud. Through his spyglass, Reed watched the colonel gathering his remaining forces. Nearly 30 hardened killers, including his personal guard of ex-cavalry officers. "He's going to hit us with everything," Marshal Hawkins observed from his position beside Reed in the church tower. "One massive strike to overwhelm our defenses." Reed's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked his Winchester. "Yes, but not where we expect it." The quiet scout's eyes narrowed as he studied Cross's preparations. "He's finally learned the lesson I've been teaching him." Below in the street, Mary Chen was organizing the last distribution of ammunition when she noticed something odd. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, but it wasn't coming from the direction of Cross's forces. "Fire!" The cry came from the western edge of town. One of Cross's smaller groups had worked their way around through Dead Man's Canyon, using the main force as a distraction. They'd set fire to the outlying buildings, and the desert wind was driving the flames toward the town center. This was Cross's true strategy. Not a frontal assault, but a calculated attempt to force the defenders to divide their attention. Reed had anticipated many possibilities, but the colonel had finally found a way to turn the town's careful preparations against it. "He's not trying to break in," Reed realized aloud. "He's trying to force us out." The fire spread quickly, feeding on sun-dried wood and summer-parched grass. Dr. Martinez and her volunteers evacuated the clinic, moving patients to the relative safety of the church basement. The defensive positions Reed had so carefully prepared began to become untenable as smoke filled the streets. Cross's main force struck then, not in a single mass, but in coordinated smaller groups, each targeting a specific weakness. They drove toward the town center from multiple directions, using the chaos of the fire to mask their approach. "Fall back to secondary positions," Reed's voice carried over the crackling of flames. "Pairs only. Cover each other." The The townspeople responded with the discipline he'd taught them, retreating in coordinated groups, maintaining their fire even as they yielded ground. But Cross had planned well. Each fallback position they reached had been compromised by smoke or flames. Mary Chen found herself cut off from the main group, pinned down in the general store with old Jim Cooper. The surveyor's face was streaked with soot, but his hands were steady on his rifle. "Reminds me of Vicksburg," the old man muttered, picking off one of Cross's men who'd ventured too close. Fire and smoke everywhere, couldn't tell friend from foe. Through gaps in the smoke they could see Cross himself, leading a group of his best men down Main Street. The colonel had abandoned his military bearing now, moving with the predatory grace of a born killer. His personal guards spread out around him, their movements showing the precise coordination that had made them legendary during the war. Reed's voice cut through the chaos, seemingly from everywhere at once. 8 years ago you used fire to destroy my home, Cross, tried to burn away everything I loved. A shot rang out, dropping one of the colonel's guards. Now you're trying the same thing here. You brought them into this ghost shot. Cross shouted back, his cultured accent cracking with fury. Their blood is on your hands. Another shot, another guard fell. No, they chose to fight, chose to stand against men like you, just like I did. The battle became a nightmare of smoke and shadows. Cross's men pressed their attack, but the townspeople refused to break. Reed had taught them too well, showed them how to fight, even when everything seemed lost. Sarah Martinez turned her clinic into a fallback point, organizing bucket lines to fight the fire while maintaining defense. Kane and Hawkins coordinated the remaining defenders, using Reed's pre-planned routes to maintain communication despite the chaos. But it was Mary Chen who saw the real danger. Cross wasn't just attacking randomly. He was methodically cutting off escape routes, herding the defenders toward the town center. The colonel had learned from his previous failures, had finally understood how Reed's mind worked. He's not trying to kill us all, she realized, sharing her insight with Cooper. He's trying to force the ghost shot to show himself. Reed had seen it too. From his elevated position, he watched Cross's strategy unfold with grudging admiration. The colonel had finally matched him, had found a way to turn the quiet scout's protective instincts against him. The fire had consumed nearly a third of Broken Ridge now, its hungry flames creating a curtain of heat and smoke that forced the defenders to cluster closer together. Cross's men maintained constant pressure, pushing them toward what seemed like their last refuge, the church where they'd moved their wounded. "You can end this ghost shot," Cross called out, his voice carrying over the roar of flames. Face me like a man, and I'll let them live." Reed's response was another precisely placed shot that sent the colonel diving for cover. "You never understood, Cross. This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about them, their right to live without fear of men like you." But the colonel's trap was closing. The defenders were running out of space and ammunition, forced into an ever-shrinking pocket of relative safety. Cross's men had surrounded the church, cutting off any hope of escape. The final confrontation was approaching, but it wouldn't be the one Cross expected. Because even as the colonel thought he was forcing Reed's hand, the quiet scout had one last plan, one final strategy that would test everything he'd taught the people of Broken Ridge. The ghost shot was about to show why some legends are born, not from seeking revenge, but from protecting others. As smoke and flames engulfed much of Broken Ridge, William Reed made his decision. For 8 years, he'd lived as a ghost, haunting the edges of society, driven by vengeance. But now, watching the townspeople fight with everything he'd taught them, he understood that some things were worth more than revenge. "Mary," he called softly into the chaos, "remember what I taught you about the church tower?" Mary Chen, still defending her position in the store with Cooper, understood immediately. Every shooting position Reed had established had a purpose, not just for defense, but for what he'd called the final option. "It's time?" she asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "It's time," Reed confirmed. "Get everyone ready. You know what to do." Through the smoke and fire, Cross watched his trap seemingly close around the defenders. His men had pushed them back to the church, exactly as planned. The colonel allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. After 8 years, he'd finally outmaneuvered the ghost shot. "It's over, ghost shot," he called out. "Surrender yourself, face me like a man, and I'll spare them." Reed's response wasn't what anyone expected. Standing atop the church tower, fully exposed, he raised his Winchester to his shoulder. "You're right about one thing, Cross. It is over." The shot that followed wasn't aimed at any of Cross's men. Instead, it struck a carefully prepared support beam near the town's water tower. The effect was immediate and devastating. The tower collapsed, sending a torrent of water through the streets of Broken Ridge. But this wasn't just random destruction. Reed had spent months preparing this moment, designing a complex system of channels and barriers. The water flowed exactly where he'd planned, creating corridors of safety through the fire while cutting off Cross's carefully positioned men. "Now!" Reed's command rang out, and the defenders moved with practiced precision. The townspeople hadn't been trapped at all. They'd been waiting. Each defensive position Reed had established contained hidden caches of ammunition and supplies. As Cross's men struggled with the sudden flood, the defenders launched a coordinated counterattack. Mary Chen led one group, using the confusion to flank Cross's right wing. Dr. Martinez and her volunteers emerged from seemingly nowhere, their precise fire forcing the colonel's left flank to scatter. Sheriff Kane and Marshal Hawkins drove straight up the center, their determined advance splitting Cross's forces further. "You see, Cross," Reed called out, his voice carrying over the chaos. "You thought you were fighting one man, but you were fighting an entire town." The colonel's carefully planned trap had become a killing ground, not just because of Reed's shooting, but because of the combined efforts of every person in Broken Ridge. They fought not as individuals, but as a community, each person covering the others, using everything the Quiet Scout had taught them. Cross, seeing his advantage evaporate, made his final play. With his remaining personal guard, he charged directly for the church tower, determined to end it with the ghost shot himself. But this too played into Reed's plan. The Quiet Scout had positioned himself deliberately, drawing Cross into the last and deadliest trap. As the colonel and his men approached, hidden defenders emerged from every direction. Even old Jim Cooper, who'd worked his way around through the chaos, added his precise fire to the fusillade. Cross's men fell one by one, until only the colonel himself remained. He managed to reach the church steps, his military precision finally giving way to raw fury. "Face me!" he screamed up at Reed. "End this like a soldier!" Reed's response was quiet, but carried clearly. "I stopped being a soldier the day you murdered my family. But I never stopped protecting people from men like you." The final shot echoed across Broken Ridge like thunder. Cross fell, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. The legendary colonel had finally met an enemy he couldn't defeat. Not just one man, but an entire community united against his kind of evil. As the smoke began to clear and the waters receded, the full extent of Reed's strategy became clear. The fire had been contained to the outer buildings, the water from the tower saving most of the town. The defenders had suffered no fatalities, though many bore wounds they would wear proudly as badges of courage. Mary found Reed in the aftermath as townspeople began the work of rebuilding. "Will you leave now?" she asked softly. "Now that it's over." The Quiet Scout looked out over Broken Ridge, seeing not the damage, but the people working together to restore their home. "No," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "For the first time in 8 years, I have a reason to stay. The legend of the ghost shot didn't end that day. It transformed." The story spread across the territories. not just of a deadly marksman who could shoot from impossible distances, but of a man who taught an entire town to stand against tyranny. The 18 notches on his Winchester became not just a tally of vengeance, but a reminder that one person's stand against evil could inspire others to find their own strength. Broken Ridge rebuilt, stronger than before, the town became known as a place where good people could live without fear, protected not just by the deadliest shot in the West, but by an entire community that had learned to protect itself. Dr. Martinez kept her clinic, though now it served more routine ailments than bullet wounds. Sheriff Kane and Marshal Hawkins remained friends, sharing stories of the battle over coffee on quiet mornings. Old Jim Cooper continued his surveying, though now he included defensive positions in all his maps, just in case, and William Reed, the man they'd called the Ghost Shot, finally found peace. He married Mary Chen the following spring, their wedding attended by the entire town. The quiet scout had discovered that while vengeance might sustain a ghost, love and community could bring a man back to life. Years later, travelers passing through Broken Ridge would sometimes see a tall figure on the church tower at dawn, Winchester rifle across his lap. The Ghost Shot still watched over his home, not as a haunting spirit of vengeance, but as a guardian of the peace he'd helped create. Some said that on quiet nights you could still hear him teaching youngsters the art of shooting, his whispered instructions carrying on the desert wind. But what he really taught them was something far more valuable, that true strength comes not from the ability to take life, but from the willingness to protect it. The deadliest shot in the West had found something better than revenge. He'd found a home, a family, and a purpose that would outlive any legend.